Do you remember when games were good? Today I want to tell you guys a story about how long ago in the ancient before times, when I was just a little kid, I used to do a lot of game modding. And back then, well, I spent pretty much all my time learning game design through mod tools of various games I used to play. And as a result, as an adult now, I still get the urge every once in a while to make really terrible, horrific mods. Recently, I've had some inspiration to do some more modding, and I've had some cool ideas that I really wanted to put into a game, but there's one little problem. Modding is kind of fucking dead. Now, obviously, it's not completely dead or anything, but think about how many games have come out recently that actually have really good, full-on mod support right out of the box. It's not many. It really isn't. It's really not a good sign that when people talk about modding, they're almost always talking about games that are 10 or 15 years old, like Source Engine games, or Minecraft, or Skyrim. Oof. The only recent game I can think of is Unreal Tournament 4, which admittedly has a pretty cool editing kit, but it's also not finished and no longer in development. I've also heard some noises that Halo Master Chief Collection for the PC might have mod tools, but I'm rather hesitant to get my hopes up for it. I believe there are two main reasons why mod tools have become so uncommon these days. The first is of course a move towards centralized servers and matchmaking, which can make modding difficult to properly support, and the second is of course microtransactions. Now I could go on for hours and hours about how microtransactions and loot boxes are just the most insidiously evil things in the entire world, but there are plenty of other people out there who can do it way better than me. No, this video has a very specific focus. I'm going to be showing all you Zoomers out there how we did it back in my day. I'm going to be giving you guys a detailed look into the process of designing and building an authentic Halo 2 map. I'll be using the exact same tools and techniques that Bungie used when they developed the original Halo trilogy. And yeah, Halo is a trilogy. Come at me, nerds. You can't fight me, I'm behind 7 VPNs right now. And one of those VPNs just so happens to be today's sponsor, NordVPN. Do you ever have one of those days where you're just trying to play some video with the boys, when all of a sudden,
You, give us your data, or we'll beat it out of you.
What? If you aren't using a VPN, this could literally be you. So why not pick up NordVPN today using the promo code InfernoPlus. NordVPN encrypts all of your online traffic, which protects you from hackers saying, "I'm in," as they empty your bank account in RuneScape. It also hides your internet browsing history from your ISP and even the government. Because seriously, do you really want the government to know what kind of degenerate filth you've been looking at? Like, bruh. Sign up for NordVPN today at nordvpn.com/InfernoPlus and get 70% off a 3-year plan. You'll never have to worry about sailing the high seas ever again. Day 1. So of course, we start this journey just like any other, with an idea. With this project, I want to do a highly vertical, team-based multiplayer map with an aesthetic similar to Coagulation. I also wanted the layout of this map to have a mix of driving and footpaths that all intersect with each other in order to create a fun, high-energy CTF map. I drew up a rough outline of what I wanted in MS Paint, and it was pretty bad, but it was enough to get started, and as a result, I popped open 3ds Max and got to work. Now, Halo 2's game engine has a lot of weird and unique quirks to it, one of them being that level design is not done in-engine with brushes, but is instead done in traditional modeling tools like 3ds Max or Blender. This has its advantages and disadvantages, of course, but I quite like it as a whole. I find working on simple meshes like this really relaxing most of the time. So now it's time to begin modeling our map. I find the best place to start is generally to create the terrain first. This gives me a really good idea of the map's overall shape, and from there I can fill in the cliff faces and then seal the map entirely. Sealing is very important, as the map has to be a single sealed interior mesh with no open edges, duplicate triangles, or degenerate faces. Any of these kinds of errors can result in unexpected behavior or collision problems in game. Once the sealing is done, we can export the model to its proprietary .ast format, and import it into Halo 2. And if you just so happen to be using the original export plugin instead of the more up-to-date one, you might just be graced with a wonderful picture of one of the Bungie employees' .as files. Epic. After that, we just have to wait for the game engine to build the map structure and then calculate lighting. Once that's finished, we can finally open up the map editor and... oh, it's a bit smaller than I expected. No problem though, just scale it up a little bit, export, structure, light, and... and perfect, or, well, functional, I guess. It isn't much to look at right now, but just about every map will start out like this. A completely barren and haphazardly textured shape of some kind. Day 2. Now with the basic shape of the map done, we need to start filling in the detail. And what better way to add detail than just throwing rocks and trees randomly all over the place? And by randomly, I of course mean very deliberately. The placement of the rocks and trees in this map will both act as cover, line of sight breaks, and even stepping stones to allow players to climb up the cliffs in specific places. After distributing the rocks and trees, I also felt like it was time to try and draw up a ground texture for the map. Ground textures in Halo are another interesting quirk of the game that I think deserves its own explanation. So for an example, here is the ground texture for coagulation. As you can see, it's a rather small texture at only 512 pixels squared, but it's used for the entire canyon. The way this works is that the ground texture is actually blended with multiple other grayscale detail textures, with the alpha channel of the ground texture acting as a mask to interpolate between the different detail textures. The result of this is that you get the color of the ground texture mixed into the tile detail textures, creating a rather nice looking effect that is very efficient to render. The downside of this is that I'm absolutely fucking terrible at painting textures. Though I guess that's only a downside if you're me. So with that explanation out of the way, here's my ground texture. It sure is a valid TIF file. After finishing up that tragedy, it was time to create some bases. I played around with a few different ideas, but eventually decided to do a sort of Forerunner containment wall type thing. Now, Forerunner architecture is a super interesting topic with tons of different styles and approaches, but I'm not even remotely qualified to speak on that. I am not an expert 3D modeler, and it has always just been a fun thing I did in my spare time. So I can't really comment on that. My approach to Forerunner geometry is 45-degree angles and extrusions, so epic. So I put together this pretty decent looking Forerunner wall, and then decided that instead of having ramps or ladders on the back, I'd have gravity lifts, because gravity lifts are cool. I also put together a simple flag stand design that I decided to put out in the open in front of the base. I felt like it would be a good idea to separate the flag stand and the team spawn area, as it can be a little bit messy when you have those two things too close together. And with that done, I exported the map again, and, well, it's definitely starting to take shape, but it's got a long way to go still. Day 3. So right off the bat, I decided to redesign the gravity lifts and the flag stand. The ones I had created before just did not look good and were not really functional either because of the shape, so it was a high priority for me to fix them. The new ones I made were much better, like a massive improvement, and I was much happier with those. Next up, I decided to add an actual physical cliff top to the map. This doesn't really serve much of a purpose, but I feel like it makes the map have a better sense of space. I also added a small facade of an upper cliff face as well. It's a small detail, but it's something that's commonly done in a lot of the original Halo 2 maps, so I decided to do it too for authenticity's sake. After that, I decided I really wanted a central structure in the map, something that would both fill the space and create symmetry, as well as acting as a line of sight break between the two bases. Once again, I did a few terrible drawings to kind of get an idea of what I wanted, and then decided to do a giant monolith type thing. It's a very simple structure, but honestly I think it makes a big difference in how the map is played. It acts as a solid choke point between the two bases, and of course it breaks line of sight, which is incredibly important. After that, I decided I really wanted to design a man cannon for each base, but honestly I was so burned out for that night that I gave up after making a few terrible attempts. Instead of that, I just added my boy Jelly Elite to the map, and called it a night. Run, my banana. You must go fast. Day 4. Picking up right from where I left off, I managed to create a man cannon that I didn't immediately hate the design of, and I put one at each base, pointing towards roughly the center of the map. After that, I went ahead and added a small bridge on the far side of the map, roughly where these man cannons land. These two changes really help with the overall flow of the map and prevent the game from being bottlenecked right around the spawn areas. It's also important to note that while this bridge is just wide enough for a player to walk over, you cannot consistently get a vehicle over it. After I finished that up, I went ahead and added a few little detail structures around. These are entirely for flavor, and they really don't serve any particular purpose. And continuing with this trend of aesthetics, I went ahead and added some random plants and foliage in various spots as well. This fern right here, this fern is the best fern. Your fern is shit. I then set up red and blue holographic light shaders. Holographic lights are a big part of Forerunner design, and are a great way to light team bases in multiplayer maps. Color coding the bases with lights like this is an incredibly common technique in multiplayer games. It gives players an immediate visual cue that tells them exactly where they are without having to actually look around and find a landmark. In a similar vein, the lighting on this map is also set up to make the bases incredibly distinct, with the blue base being completely in shadow and the red base being in sunlight. I feel like these kinds of subtle design choices actually do make a pretty big difference in the way a map plays, despite being something that you probably would never think about. After finishing up all these changes, I decided to export and test the map again. And while the lighting calculations were chugging along, I had the urge to do something stupid. So I deep fried a warthog. I might be the first person to ever deep fry a video game object. Hopefully I'm pushing the meme meta forward today. Day 5. Up until this point, I've been putting off one of the bigger tasks for this map. And in order to explain this, I'm going to have to teach you guys a bit about UV coordinates. Now I'm sure most of you who are still watching this incredibly nerdy video know at least the basics of how 3D models work. You have meshes which are made up of polygons, which are made up of groups of triangles, which are each individually made up of 3 vertices, which consist of 3 floating point values representing the X, Y, and Z position in 3D space. But that only defines its shape, position, and orientation. How do we define how textures show up on its surface? Well, that is where UV coordinates come in, and also normals and tangents, but this video is long enough as is, so let's just not get into that mess. The simplest way to think of UV coordinates is sort of like the 2D surface area of a triangle, which we can manipulate in order to change how textures are displayed on it. Now, the reason I'm explaining this is because one of the remaining tasks for this map is to unwrap the UV coordinates for the entire cliff face into a single seamless strip. The best way to visualize this is like flattening out a large folded up piece of paper. We're taking a complex 3D shape and slowly flattening it out into a single 2D surface. During this process, I opted to use a checkerboard instead of the actual cliff texture, as it makes it very easy to see tiny distortions and seams while I'm working. Trying to keep this surface clean and natural is very important, as even the tiniest mistake can result in stretched or even squished textures. Overall, this process took a few hours to complete, but the result was a nearly perfect seamless unwrap, and I was very happy with it. After finishing that up, I decided to add a small pool of water at the bottom of the map as well. Now you think this would be a simple process, but this is Halo 2's engine we're talking about, so of course not. So to start off, we create 2 planes in our map, the first being the actual water itself, and the second defines a height for a planar fog value. You then create and assign a water shader, which uses an animated normal map to create a kind of wavy refracty effect. You then have to compile the map and open the scenario and structure files to add a definition for the water and also a definition for the planar fog below it. And if you did all of that exactly right, you might get something that sort of resembles water in your map. Or a giant black void. I mean, it just sort of happens, Now, just because you have something that looks like water in your map, doesn't mean you actually have water just yet. The actual water effect is determined by the physical surface below the water. So what you have to do is split your terrain into 2 separate shaders, one to use for the dry ground and the other for the wet ground. You then have to go into that shader and assign a collision material for one of the various liquid types. Now you have water that is actually water. Congratulations. After I finished making the map moist, I went ahead and threw in some portal planes as well. These essentially divide the map into multiple sections, which are used for a variety of purposes, though I believe the primary reason is for occlusion culling. And yeah, I really am just going to use a weird, esoteric term like that and not even explain it at all. So at this point in the map's development, all the major components are finished. It's just a matter of carefully tweaking and cleaning things up now. From here on out, I'm going to spend a lot of time making really small adjustments to various aspects of the map, and honestly, they're mostly things that people would never notice anyway, but I know they're wrong, so I have to fix them. God damn it. Day 6. More texture work. Oh, it's my favorite. So our ground texture really needs some work here. It's abysmal, so I did my absolute best here to improve it, and honestly, I think it's a little less hideous now. At least a little. After that, I spent some time aligning the man cannons and setting up the necessary tags to make them actually functional. While doing this, I was rather surprised to find that gravity lifts are actually invisible and stationary physics objects that just have very odd properties defined in their physics model. I knew Halo 2 had a lot of hacky and weird stuff in it, but I had no idea that the grav lifts were just janky physics models, apparently. On the bright side though, since this is part of the physics model, you could technically attach a man cannon to basically anything in the game, including the player character or a warthog. So I'll keep that in mind for the future. Sounds fun. After that, I began adding various bits of physics scenery to the map. Stuff like crates and watering cans. But at some point during this, I accidentally broke something, and the entire map ended up looking like this. Luckily, this was not a major problem, and I worked it out after a few minutes, but I felt like it was worth sharing because it was just so wondrous to behold. And with that sorted out, it was finally time to do weapon and power-up placement. This is a very critical part of balancing, and can easily make or break a map, and as a result, I had spent pretty much the entire time working on this project, thinking about where I wanted to place everything. The most important weapon on the map, by far, is the battle rifle. This is the bread and butter of Halo 2, and honestly, it's kinda OP. I decided to put 3 battle rifle spawns at each base, and also scattered a few extra ones all throughout the map. It may seem excessive to have a ton of spawns of the same weapon, but when it comes to Halo 2, you literally have to have this damn weapon. If someone has a battle rifle and you don't, you are basically defenseless. So having them available everywhere is way better than having everyone fight over 2 or 3 spawns of it. Next, I added a shotgun at each of the bases, as it's a pretty decent base defense weapon, but honestly, anywhere else it's pretty terrible due to its short range. After that, I put an energy sword on this upper ledge here, as this location makes a lot of sense, and it's one of the few areas in the map that has good close quarters combat, and it also allows you to jump down on people and sword them in the face. I then added a rocket launcher in the dead center of the map. This spot is fairly out of the way for anyone traveling on foot, and honestly, it's a terrible spot to get caught if you're not in a vehicle. And speaking of strong weapons, there is of course a sniper rifle. I placed it in the actual riskiest spot on the map, dead center, right out in the open. Grabbing the sniper rifle puts you at risk of being shot at from literally every direction, so it's pretty well balanced out by the fact that it's one of the strongest weapons on the map. And finally, I threw a randomized active camo and overshield underneath the cliffs at each base. There's not much reason to come down here, so I decided to put these power-ups here just to incentivize people actually using this space to some degree. The rest of the weapons on the map are a lot less critical. There's a variety of SMGs and plasma rifles and stuff, just spaced out evenly across the map. Unfortunately, Halo 2 was just not really that well balanced, and it's rare that anyone opts to use them over the battle rifle. But that does not mean they don't have their own niches. Of course, sometimes a plasma rifle SMG combo can be incredibly effective. So after finishing up the weapon layout, I then moved on to game type and spawn point setup. There isn't really a lot to say about it, just putting flags on flag stands and team spawns in the bases. It's fairly tedious, but it has to be done. So after that, I went ahead and ran lighting calculations on their highest settings and compiled the map for some more testing. Everything seemed to be working just fine, but I did find a couple of interesting ways to get out of bounds. Pulling either of these off during an actual game would be fairly tough, so I didn't bother fixing them, and instead just placed a deep-fried warthog way up on top of the map for anyone who figures out how to get out there. Then finally, it came time for our last tedious little task: painting detail objects. This is the process of adding little rocks and bits of grass to the ground, and honestly, the tool for doing it is just an absolute jank fest. There's no way to actually see how it looks without compiling and testing it in-game, so you more or less have to guess your way through. It's very easy to accidentally paint grass on top of rocks or walls. It's honestly just a major oof on all counts, and I really feel bad for the guy who had to do this for every single map in Halo 2's original roster. Day 7. Just wrapping things up, a couple of texture tweaks here and there, moved a couple spawn points. Once I was happy with everything, I gave the map a fitting name, ran the last light map calculation, compiled it, and uploaded it. Roughly 35 hours of work, 19,000 triangles, 33 materials, and a final size of 18 megabytes.
I've moved on to it, so.
Oh, you ran him over!
What is going on? Oh, table game, dude.
What did you do?
I fucking
too.
table game.
On the whole, I think the map turned out pretty good. It definitely shines in team game modes like CTF, and the matches were generally fast-paced and pretty intense. The open design of the map lends it a non-stop action feeling. Because the bases are so close together but separated by height, it allows you to jump straight down from spawn right into the middle of a firefight. I also feel like the way the footpaths and vehicle paths are weaved together worked out really nicely. There's nothing quite as sick as jumping a warthog off a cliff and landing right on top of one of those dirty blues. I also like the way the map's aesthetics turned out as well. It feels like it could very easily fit in with many of the original Halo 2 maps. In fact, here's a couple of them for comparison. Alright, that's enough patting myself on the back, so let's talk about what went wrong. The battle rifle. My god, I knew this thing was OP, but man, I was not ready for how much pure battle rifleage there was going to be during that stream. My map was designed as a mid-range centric map, and it just feels like no other weapon even comes close to competing with the freaking battle rifle. Even the rocket launcher and sniper rifle have a hard time dealing with it. It's just flat out way too good on every level. People were even shooting at each other with battle rifles from across the spawn points, because despite it being at the max range, you could still kill someone if you got a good clean shot on them. I don't really feel like this is the fault of the map, honestly. It's just kind of a Halo 2 problem in general. If I were to rebalance the map around this, I would probably change some of the cliff faces to break line of sight over the middle better. Having players standing on top of their bases shooting at each other is not really ideal, but luckily it wasn't a dominant strategy, it was just something that was more annoying than effective. Another problem with the map's design was the overall tendency towards defense. While playing on the map on my stream, we had a ton of CTF matches. Most of them went pretty quickly with 8 to 10 players, but at one point we started a CTF match with a nearly full server, and wow, that match took over an hour to complete. Since the map is so compact, it becomes nearly impossible to approach the enemy base and actually get away with the flag once you have too many players. When we finally managed to break through and get the winning cap, I stopped to check the post-game scoreboard, and bruh. And of course, there were also some bugs. My favorite of these being that in free-for-all game modes, it always chooses this one specific spawn point every single time for every single player. So yeah, that's some quality Slayer right there, my friends. Oh, and of course, there's the mystery of the slightly misaligned carbine that just falls into the void every 25 seconds. This is so sad. Alexa, play Breaking Benjamin. So yeah, there were a couple of weird problems here and there, but I made sure to clean it up as best I could for the public release. Which leads us to the end of the video. If you're interested in playing some good old Halo 2, you can actually get the game for free from the Halo 2 Project Cartographer website, and if you're interested in playing my map, there's a link in the description to download it. This was a fun little experiment to try, and I hope you guys enjoyed this sort of insight into how Halo 2 was designed and built. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, let me know, and I'll do more of it in the future. But for now, thanks for watching, and don't forget to BXR.